For several seconds, nobody inside the Windsor gathering moved. Duchess Sophie had just said aloud what others had apparently been too cautious, too loyal, or too frightened to declare. William and Catherine must lead this family now. It was not whispered in a corridor. It was not softened into diplomatic language. Sophie delivered the sentence directly, and the reaction around her made one thing frighteningly clear: the monarchy had just crossed an invisible line. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Sophie had spoken during a private family discussion at Windsor after months of pressure over royal workloads, public confidence, and the growing question of how much responsibility Charles should continue carrying personally. The royal family's working structure, meaning the group of senior royals who perform official duties on behalf of the monarch, had been under strain. Sophie did not disguise her conclusion. William and Catherine, she said, needed to become the leading force guiding the family now. Charles did not answer immediately. The king slowly placed the pen in his hand on the table and looked toward William. His silence held more than irritation. It carried the deeper wound of a father hearing a conversation about support shift dangerously close to a conversation about succession in everything but name. Charles understood Sophie was not calling for his removal, yet he could also hear what her words implied. The family's center of gravity might already be moving. William looked deeply uncomfortable. The prince did not seize the moment or endorse Sophie's declaration. Catherine watched him carefully because she understood the trap. If her husband agreed too quickly, it could look like ambition at his father's expense. If he rejected the idea completely, he would be denying responsibilities that were already gathering around them. Sophie refused to retreat. She explained that leadership did not mean replacing Charles as monarch. It meant recognizing where the family's operational and emotional center had begun shifting. William and Catherine were increasingly expected to steady younger royals, carry major public duties, and represent continuity when uncertainty surrounded the older generation. Edward looked around the room and noticed something even more unsettling. Several senior family members avoided challenging his wife directly. Their silence became louder than agreement. Sophie had not simply shocked Windsor. She had spoken a possibility others seemed unwilling to deny. And to understand why Sophie risked saying the one sentence capable of changing the atmosphere around Charles, William, and Catherine, we have to understand what each of them stood to lose the moment those words entered the room. The statement sounded like a question of leadership, but inside the family, it landed as something far more personal. For Charles, it touched mortality and legacy. For William, it threatened to accelerate a destiny he has spent his entire life preparing for, but never controlling. For Catherine, it carried expectations extending far beyond ceremony. And for Sophie, speaking those words meant risking the trust she had spent decades quietly building inside the monarchy. Sophie had never built influence by demanding the center of attention. Her strength inside the family came from the opposite instinct: discretion, consistency, and the ability to remain close to senior royals without turning every private concern into a public position. That was why her declaration carried unusual weight. The monarchy's line of succession, meaning the formal order determining who inherits the throne, already placed William and then his children at the heart of the future. But Sophie was speaking about something less constitutional and more immediate, who was already holding the family together emotionally. Charles felt that distinction and still found it painful. When the meeting briefly paused, the king moved away from the table and asked a question that exposed the wound beneath his silence. "Do they think I cannot carry them anymore?" Sophie answered carefully. She told him the issue was not whether he could carry the family, it was whether he should still be expected to carry everything alone. Charles understood the loyalty inside her answer, but that did not remove the sting. A monarch can prepare an heir for the future while still struggling with the moment everyone begins looking toward that heir in the present. Catherine carried a different fear. Privately, she told William she did not want the discussion to become a contest between generations. The princess understood, that being presented as the answer to every royal problem could create resentment inside the very family she would one day be expected to unite. William agreed, but Sophie's wording disturbed him for another reason. It had sounded considered, almost prepared. Edward saw the danger too. He quietly warned his wife that courtiers would never treat those words as an ordinary family opinion. A courtier, meaning a senior figure working closely around the royal household, would interpret such a statement as evidence that an internal consensus might already be forming. Sophie did not deny she had thought about it before speaking. That admission stayed with William. Something had happened before Windsor. Something specific had convinced her that responsibility was already shifting, whether anyone officially admitted it or not. Sophie's statement had shocked Windsor, but the real story began earlier, during one seemingly controlled royal occasion, when a quiet breakdown behind closed doors convinced her that the balance of responsibility had already shifted. Every family reaches a moment that only becomes important in hindsight. For Sophie, that moment arrived weeks earlier, after a major Windsor reception, when the public smiles disappeared, the doors closed, and exhaustion finally became impossible to disguise. What she witnessed that evening did not look like a constitutional crisis. It looked painfully human. Yet Sophie left believing one thing with absolute clarity. The monarchy was depending on William and Catherine long before anyone was prepared to admit it. Charles had spent months carrying two burdens at once. The king was expected to remain steady as sovereign, while also navigating family strain that never stopped simply because ceremonial duties continued. A sovereign, meaning the reigning monarch who formally leads the institution, cannot easily separate private emotion from public responsibility. Sophie had watched that pressure build. She had also watched William move constantly between supporting his father and managing the growing expectations placed on him as heir. Then the Windsor reception ended, and something shifted. Charles left a private post-event discussion abruptly after an exhausting argument over upcoming royal duties. The king did not surrender authority, but his departure left unfinished decisions behind. William immediately began reorganizing commitments, trying to prevent confusion from spreading. Catherine moved differently. The princess noticed which relatives were tense, which conversations were close to breaking down, and quietly lowered the temperature without turning herself into the center of attention. Sophie remained in the room and watched them stabilize everything without being asked. That moment stayed with her. Later that evening, she found Catherine alone and asked whether she was all right. The princess admitted that she was less worried about herself than about William. He was being asked to behave as son, heir, husband, and mediator at the same time. Sophie heard no complaint in the words. That made them more troubling. Then Charles gave her another piece of the truth. In a separate corridor, the king admitted his frustration that every difficult decision now seemed to affect William personally. He did not speak of stepping back. He did not question his own authority. But Sophie heard exhaustion beneath the control. The following morning, she told Edward what she believed had already happened. Whenever the family became emotionally unstable, everyone instinctively turned toward William and Catherine. Leadership, she said, had started changing before titles had. Sophie still resolved not to interfere, but that restraint would not survive the next Windsor disagreement. The reception had planted the thought, but Windsor would force Sophie to act, because when father and son finally confronted the same uncomfortable reality from opposite sides, someone had to say what neither of them could. The confrontation did not begin with shouting. It began with something colder. Charles questioned whether William was moving too quickly into responsibilities that still belonged to the sovereign. William answered that he was only handling problems being placed in front of him. Then Sophie stepped between two generations, carrying years of unspoken pressure, and the polite language disappeared. What followed was not rebellion against a king. It was a family finally arguing about the future, while the future stood inside the room. Charles wanted the structure of authority to remain unmistakable. The king understood that delegation was necessary, but he also knew monarchy depends on clarity about who ultimately carries responsibility. William saw the same situation from the opposite side. The prince had increasingly been expected to absorb difficult family disputes, demanding engagements, and private tensions before they reached his father. Sophie recognized that neither man was acting from pure ambition. One was protecting the dignity of his reign. The other was trying to stop that reign from becoming an unbearable weight. Then Charles turned directly toward his son. "Do you believe I am standing in your way?" William paused. He said no. Then he added something harder. The family could not continue pretending every decision had to pass through one person before anyone else was permitted to act. Charles pushed his chair back sharply. Catherine reached toward William's arm, but he remained standing. The princess understood how quickly concern could begin sounding like challenge. Sophie understood it too, yet she refused to soften what she believed. William and Catherine, she said, had to be allowed to lead more of the family's day-to-day direction. Succession, meaning the planned transfer of royal responsibility from one generation to the next, could not begin only when crisis forced it. Preparation had to happen while Charles was still fully capable of guiding it. Sophie then revealed that Edward had heard these concerns before. The Duke had watched William repeatedly absorb arguments and family pressures that never reached the public, and he had reached much the same conclusion. Charles looked around the room. He expected resistance to Sophie's position. None came. That silence transformed the argument. This was no longer one woman challenging the king. It was the formal hierarchy colliding with a practical reality already taking shape beneath it. Charles finally ended the meeting. Before leaving, however, he looked toward William and delivered one final warning. Leadership is easier to demand than to carry. The words stayed behind after he left. Sophie had broken the silence, but declarations alone could change nothing. The next battle would be quieter, because inside monarchy, influence is often decided not by who speaks loudest, but by who receives the next call when something goes wrong. After the confrontation, Windsor did something revealing. It carried on. Papers still moved. Engagements still required decisions. Family disagreements still demanded resolution. But now everyone watched one detail: the direction in which those problems traveled. Sophie's words had created a test nobody needed to announce. If pressure arrived, would the family still instinctively turn toward Charles? Or had William and Catherine quietly become the place where uncertainty was already being taken for answers? Royal influence had never depended on titles alone. Practical power also came from trust, accessibility, judgment, and the ability to calm difficult situations before they became larger crises. William carried constitutional importance as heir, meaning he stood next in line to the throne, and already held responsibilities tied to the monarchy's future. Catherine carried something different. People trusted her privately. Together, they were beginning to occupy spaces Charles could not always reach in the same way. Sophie discovered that truth almost by accident. A call came concerning tension around an upcoming family appearance. The details were delicate enough that one wrong decision could create fresh resentment. Sophie held the phone for several seconds and considered contacting Charles. Then she called Catherine. The choice unsettled her immediately. She had just demonstrated the very shift she had defended inside Windsor. Catherine did not sound pleased by the growing dependence. Later, she told William that every problem sent toward them brought another layer of responsibility, and responsibilities accepted quietly had a way of becoming permanent. The princess understood that leadership could expand long before anyone formally acknowledged it. William heard something darker beneath her concern. "What bothers me," he admitted, "is that my father can see it happening too." Edward soon added another piece. He told Sophie that senior household figures had begun quietly preparing more scenarios in which William would coordinate wider family representation. Household planning, meaning the internal preparation used to organize which royals handled duties and public responsibilities, still placed Charles firmly at the center. But contingency thinking was changing. Then one sensitive family dispute was resolved, without reaching the king at all. Charles eventually heard about it. He did not immediately ask why he had been excluded. He asked who had handled it. William and Catherine. The king became unusually quiet. That silence carried none of the fury Sophie expected. Instead, Charles appeared to absorb the answer as evidence. Perhaps his son was not trying to take authority from him. Perhaps responsibility was simply moving toward the people best positioned to carry certain parts of it. And then Charles made a decision nobody anticipated. He would test the shift himself. Charles had every reason to resist what Sophie proposed. Yet his next move was more complicated than resistance. He stepped back from one crucial family decision and watched what William and Catherine would do without him. The first consequence arrived without ceremony. Charles did not issue a declaration. He did something far more revealing. When a difficult family decision reached him, he sent it to William. No speech, no explanation, just a quiet instruction that the prince should handle it. For William, the moment brought no satisfaction. He understood exactly what his father was doing. Charles was testing Sophie's argument, and possibly testing whether he himself could tolerate the answer. William received responsibility for a sensitive dispute surrounding an upcoming senior family appearance. The issue was not merely scheduling. Several relatives wanted different roles, and any decision risked creating the impression that one branch of the family had been favored over another. Charles gave his son genuine discretion, meaning the freedom to make the decision rather than simply recommend one. When William read the instruction, he looked at it twice before placing his phone down. Catherine noticed immediately. "What happened?" William answered quietly. "He wants me to decide." The prince did not sound empowered. He sounded unsettled. Catherine understood why. A responsibility like this could appear small from outside, but inside the family it represented something larger. Charles was no longer asking his son what he thought. He was allowing him to carry the consequence. Catherine became central to the solution, because the conflict involved personalities as much as duties. The princess urged William not to create winners and losers. Instead, they divided responsibilities clearly, giving each person a meaningful role, while preserving Charles's visible position at the center of the occasion. The king spent the afternoon resisting the urge to interfere. When an aide offered to bring him the latest developments, Charles declined. The restraint cost him. Stepping back might have been intended as trust, but emotionally, it came dangerously close to feeling like proof that things could continue without him. Then the final arrangement arrived. Charles read it carefully. Nothing challenged his authority. William had solved the dispute without diminishing his father, and Catherine had helped prevent resentment from spreading through the family. The result proved something Sophie had been trying to explain all along. Greater responsibility for the younger couple did not have to mean less dignity for the king. Charles's resistance softened. But paperwork could only resolve the practical question. The deeper wound remained. The practical test was over, but father and son still carried the wound beneath it, and no institutional arrangement could heal that. Only one private conversation could decide whether Sophie's statement would divide the family or finally bring it closer. When Charles asked William to remain behind, everyone else left. Catherine walked out first. Sophie followed. The door closed, leaving a king and his heir without advisors, titles, or an audience. For perhaps the first time since the argument began, neither man needed to defend a position. Charles was no longer answering Sophie. William was no longer proving he could lead. They were simply father and son confronting the fear underneath everything. That preparing for tomorrow might feel like surrendering today. Charles spoke first. The king made clear that William's growing confidence had never been the problem. What hurt was the possibility that his own family had begun measuring his relevance against his son's readiness. Sovereignty, meaning the monarch's ultimate constitutional authority, still belonged entirely to him. Yet Sophie's words had made him feel, for one painful instant, as though everyone in the room had already started looking past him. William answered carefully. The prince told his father he had never wanted to rush toward the crown. Preparation had been part of his life for as long as he could remember, but preparation was not ambition. What frightened him most was the idea that every time he stepped forward to help, Charles might mistake support for impatience. Then the king finally admitted what Sophie's declaration had done to him. "When she said you and Catherine must lead this family now," Charles said, "for a moment, I felt as though the room had moved beyond me while I was still sitting in it." William did not dismiss the feeling. Instead, he gave his father a different way to see it. Leadership, he said, did not have to pass from one generation to another like an object being surrendered. The family could be guided by the younger generation in some areas while still being anchored by the older one. Charles did not have to disappear for William to become more useful. That distinction changed the conversation. Charles acknowledged that Catherine had become an unusually important emotional stabilizer inside the family. The princess could calm tensions without making anyone feel defeated. William, meanwhile, had already grown into responsibilities that could no longer be postponed merely to preserve appearances. The king made his decision. He would allow a broader division of family leadership while remaining unequivocally sovereign. It was not abdication. It was not displacement. It was continuity through shared strength. William left the room carrying no sense of victory. But Sophie saw his expression and understood immediately that something fundamental had shifted. The family had found its answer privately, but once Sophie's words reached beyond palace walls, a deeply personal adjustment inside Windsor would suddenly become a national argument about the future of the monarchy. By morning, the private sentence had become public property. Sophie's words dominated conversation because they seemed to confirm something many royal watchers believed they could already see. William and Catherine were no longer simply preparing for a distant future, they were becoming central to the monarchy's present. Yet behind the dramatic headlines was a more complicated reality. The statement had not toppled Charles. It had exposed a family attempting to strengthen itself before pressure forced change upon it. Charles remained firmly at the center of palace messaging. The king was still sovereign, meaning the reigning monarch with ultimate constitutional authority, while William and Catherine were described as taking on broader responsibilities in support of him. Commentators immediately divided. Some called Sophie's words evidence of a generational shift already underway. Others argued that sharing workload did not alter the constitutional order at all. The disagreement only made the story larger. Sophie watched the reaction grow and, for the first time, questioned whether she had caused more pain than clarity. The Duchess of Edinburgh had wanted the family to confront reality, not turn Charles into a symbol of decline. Edward understood that fear. He told his wife that silence might have preserved appearances, but it would not have forced the conversation that finally allowed father and son to understand each other. Catherine faced another kind of discomfort. The princess disliked being presented as part of a replacement narrative, especially after hearing how deeply that idea had wounded Charles. She told William they now had to support his father visibly enough that cooperation could never be mistaken for competition. Then the public spectacle intensified. A morning front page carried a large photograph of William and Catherine beneath the fictional headline, "The future is already here." Outside Buckingham Palace, tourists and royal supporters gathered under rain umbrellas, while television crews asked whether Sophie had simply said aloud what people had been watching for months. Later that day, Charles appeared publicly beside William. That single appearance changed the emotional temperature. The king and the prince exchanged an easy moment, and suddenly the story looked less like a struggle for control and more like deliberate continuity between generations. Sophie saw the coverage and understood the irony. Her words had created the impression of division, yet the result had pushed the family toward a clearer public display of unity. Nothing had been overthrown, something had been adjusted. Once the headlines faded, only one question remained to be settled inside the family, not who had won, but what Sophie's intervention had permanently changed between Charles, William, Catherine, and the institution they all served. In the end, Sophie's statement did not become the declaration that removed Charles from the center of royal life. It became something subtler, and ultimately more important. She forced the family to confront a transition they had been trying to manage without naming. Charles remained king. William remained heir. Catherine remained beside him. But the relationships between them changed, because responsibility was finally allowed to move forward without being mistaken for disloyalty. Charles preserved his unquestioned position as sovereign, while allowing William and Catherine to take a more explicit role in coordinating family responsibilities, managing sensitive internal pressures, and representing continuity. Sovereign, meaning the reigning monarch who holds the crown's constitutional authority, still described the king alone. Nothing about the new balance altered that. What changed was the willingness to admit that leadership could be shared in practice without becoming a contest over the throne. Sophie understood that distinction better than anyone. Her statement had never been intended to diminish Charles. She had wanted to prevent responsibility from crushing him, while also preventing William from being forced to absorb growing pressure without recognition or support. Then came the final family meeting. Charles looked directly at Sophie. "I did not like hearing what you said," the king told her. He paused before adding, "But I needed to hear it." Sophie did not smile in triumph. She simply nodded. Relief replaced the tension she had carried since Windsor, because honesty had survived without destroying trust. William then thanked his father for giving him greater responsibility without forcing him to behave as though he wanted the crown sooner. The prince had spent his life preparing for a future he could never control, and now preparation no longer had to feel like impatience. Catherine reinforced the balance. The princess made clear that whatever influence she and William carried would remain rooted in supporting Charles, not competing with him. Her words mattered, because the greatest danger had never been constitutional rebellion. It had been emotional misunderstanding. Charles finally understood that allowing his son to grow stronger did not make him weaker. William understood something equally important. Preparing to lead did not require emotionally separating himself from his father. That was Sophie's real achievement. She had not predicted a new monarch. She had forced the family to recognize what it needed now, a working partnership between generations, strong enough to stop future transition from becoming future crisis. Windsor no longer treated succession as a threat waiting somewhere ahead. It treated it as a responsibility that could be prepared for together. And that was the true meaning of Sophie's shocking declaration. William and Catherine did not have to replace Charles to begin leading beside him. What sounded at first like a challenge to a king ultimately became an act of loyalty to the family, and a decisive acknowledgement that the monarchy's future had finally begun taking shape within its present. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.